Welcome to Be With Champions. I'm your host, Greg Bennett. And in today's episode, I chat with Dr. Tommy Wood. And Dr. Wood's understanding of human health, performance, and longevity is just absolutely remarkable. His ability to take, complex scientific research and simplify it is just so incredible. So many great takeaways in this episode. We discuss his recent paper on metabolic health and lifestyle medicine and how it should be the cornerstone of future pandemic preparedness. And we discuss optimizing human performance. We look at hot and cold therapies. And when we discuss nutrition, we look at real food diets and fasting and monitoring your blood sugar. We discuss supplementing with creatine and vitamin D and zinc and copper. And we discuss the effects of caffeine and how we can best use caffeine for performance and just every day. And then his tips for sleeping better were just incredible insights for me, and I'm going to use myself for sure. And we finished with discussing how visualizing and the importance of visualizing and how it can affect us hormonally. And I just absolutely loved that. A few things before we get going. If you want to go to bennettendurance.com/media, you can get the show notes there, timestamps, links, and the sponsorship coupon codes are there. I think the timestamps would be really great for this episode, so you can really go back to areas that you want to re-listen to. Please subscribe and share. You'll be doing me a huge favor if you do that. And I'm also loving the feedback, so please keep it coming, whether that's on iTunes. I can't get back to you on iTunes, but I do read it and I do listen to what you're saying, so I appreciate that. And otherwise, you can get in touch with me on the social media, Instagram, Greg Bennett World, or on Twitter, Greg Bennett 1, or on Facebook or LinkedIn, I'm just Greg Bennett. So look, I'm probably going to go re-listen to this episode several times over the coming months. Just absolutely so much information in this one. And Dr. Tommy Wood was just absolutely fantastic. So enjoy this one. I really did. Before we start, I've got to give a quick shout out to the brands that make this show possible. The only brands I'm working with are brands that provide products that I use daily and truly believe in. These products support my immunity, they help improve my recovery and my focus. First up, my friends at Athletic Greens. I love this company and I love their all-in-one daily drink. It's become a part of my morning routine. I'm heavily focused on supporting my immunity and boosting my energy and helping my gut health, but I want to do it naturally. And I found that support with Athletic Greens, a whole food sourced green drink that tastes great and there's no hassle. It's delivered straight to your door. And it's a highly absorbable powder that takes seconds to mix with water, so there's no clumpiness to deal with. I can't believe a green drink sourced from whole foods can actually taste so good. Personally, I truly love it. It's developed from a complex blend of 75 vitamins and minerals. It's packed with adaptogens for recovery, probiotics and digestive enzymes for gut health, and vitamin C and zinc citrate for immune support. So Athletic Greens is designed to help fill the nutritional gaps in your diet. And there's a great offer going on now for you to give it a try. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Greg to claim our special offer of 20 free daily travel packets with your first order. $79 added value. And get Athletic Greens delivered straight to your door. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Greg. This show is also brought to you by my friends at Hyperice. Some of these products I've been using for almost a decade. Makers of the award-winning Hypervolt, the world's most powerful percussion massage device featuring Quiet Glide technology. Hyperice is a wellness tech company that makes devices designed to help you move better. From handheld massage devices to vibrating foam rollers, thermal technology, and the Normatec compression systems, Hyperice helps you warm up faster, recover quicker, and simply move better. Used in professional training rooms throughout the NBA, the NFL, MLB, the MLS, Ironman, and other professional organizations for well over a decade. Designed to help improve circulation, flexibility, and relieve tension. Get $50 off all percussion devices now, no code needed, and get an additional 10% off with code GREG10 at hyperice.com. That's hyperice.com, HYPERICE.com, and use code GREG10 for 10% off. All right, my guest today simply blows my mind with his academic prowess. He received his bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of Cambridge, a medical degree from the University of Oxford, and a Ph.D. in physiology and neuroscience from the University of Oslo. His passion for human health and performance and longevity is just absolutely contagious. And he's currently a research faculty at the University of Washington in the Department of Pediatrics. His research focusing on ways to increase resilience and treat the injury of the developing brain. He has enormous experience in coaching and being a competitor in rowing and CrossFit, powerlifting, and ultra-endurance racing. But he just has a down-to-earth approach to optimizing human performance. And he's been just a great sounding board for me over the last few years. And I'm excited and just a little bit in awe of just having such a brilliant mind on the show. So welcome and thank you for joining me on Be With Champions, Dr.
Wow.
Tommy Wood. How are you, mate?
What an intro. I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk with you.
No, mate, I'm always, I'm a little intimidated. I can have athletes on this show and chat on podcasts and I feel quite comfortable. But you know, when you look at what you've studied and your, like I said, your academic prowess, it's really quite phenomenal. I mean, I'm not in that academic world. So I look at I grew up watching Chariots of Fire and things like that. So when I see, Cambridge University and that kind of thing, I'm like, oh, wow. So look, today I want to sort of discuss so many things. Your paper that you did on, how lifestyle medicine can prepare for the next pandemic. I want to discuss on techniques for optimizing human performance and longevity and all of that. But before we do, I'd like to start by kind of getting to know you a little better and maybe wind the clock back a bit and have an understanding of how your background in sport, but then how that also, moved into academics and, the science and medical and all of that. So can we wind that clock right back and how did it all begin, mate?
Yeah, that's an interesting and great question. If anybody knew me as a kid or a teenager, they know that I had very little interest in health in general. Most of my afternoons were spent seeing how many chocolate biscuits I could eat in front of the TV after school. The answer to that is a lot. And it wasn't really until, I guess, sort of just right at the end of secondary school and then into my gap year where I started to get interested in, I guess, looking good naked. I mean, that's the only way to describe it, really. As a teenager, that's sort of what you're focused on, and mainly because my girlfriend dumped me, and I thought if I got a six pack, she might love me again, which, as I'm sure everybody listening to this knows, is just not true. But it was worth a shot, and so that's where I started on this, and certainly for the first year, then into my undergraduate time at Cambridge, I spent a lot of time rowing, more time rowing than studying, really. But it sort of became, again, what maybe many people might identify with, a real obsession. And I mean, I took it more like further than it was good for my health in terms of the amount of control I put into what I ate, how much I worried about sort of how much volume I was doing, always wanted to work harder, train more, always worried about the quality of the food that I was eating. I've joked before that I had orthorexia before it was, sexy. And there's actually quite, there's sort of a lot of problems that came with that in terms of both my, personal health and how I felt about myself, which took a long time to kind of fix. And it's something that I see in a lot of the athletes that I've worked with in terms of, the amount of training they want to do, their fixation with the food that they eat, how they look. And there's multiple reasons for that, but there's also a lot of benefit you can get from having seen that side of things, I think. So that was kind of like the start of my journey. As I sort of learned more and looked after myself a bit better into medical school, I spent quite a bit of time researching or starting to research just on the side, like all the different things, all the factors that can go into chronic health conditions, particularly multiple sclerosis. So that was my interest at the time. Worked with various family members because my brother-in-law had multiple sclerosis and he's essentially my age. And we treated it as an engineering problem. If we understand all the outputs, all the inputs, and have some idea of the system in between, can we start to figure out all the things that might sort of increase your likelihood of getting and then having progression of multiple sclerosis? So that's when I started to think about weird things that infections can do, and heavy metals can do, and nutrient deficiencies can do, and how those might affect your health. And then later on, when I started my PhD, so I went to medical school. I worked as a junior doctor in London for a couple of years, and I mean, there's basically no time to think about anything else other than the patients in front of you when you're doing that. But later on, I started my PhD, and I got a chance to sit down and think about all these things again. And so I was looking at particularly neonatal brain injury, but also had a big personal interest in health and performance. So I started a blog, started doing some podcasts, eventually sort of hooked up online with a guy called Chris Kelly, who started a company called Nourish, Balance, Thrive, working with mainly endurance athletes who had sort of messed up their health doing all the things that they were told that they should do to improve their performance, like crush themselves in workouts several hours a day and then eat nothing but refined carbohydrates. That was supposedly the key to performance, and a lot of people get spat out of the back of that with really bad long-term health problems. And so we worked with a lot of athletes through that company, and then eventually also hooked up with Luke Bennett, who you've had on the podcast at Hinter, and I now sort of work alongside him with some of their Formula One drivers. So through this whole period, I've been, had like one career, which is looking at brain injury, particularly in babies, but now increasingly in traumatic brain injury, concussions, and how those things might interact. Sort of how do you keep your brain healthy across an entire lifespan? That's sort of an area of research that I'm really sort of actively focused in academically. And then on the side, I've worked with various athletic groups trying to maximize their health and performance, and particularly with the groups that we worked with, and with my own personal view, it's much less, or if somebody comes to me as a coach, it was much less about how can I get this specific performance in this specific race. It was more about how can I be healthy and maintain my performance for years into the future. How can we create a robust and resilient human being that's going to keep showing up to the start line in 10 years, 20 years time, because that's not how most people necessarily think about athletic performance. They might be thinking about this season, doing anything to perform in this season, but then they might be reducing their ability to then perform the season after and the season after. So thinking about performance longevity is something that we spent a lot of time doing.
Touching on that, I had a guest on one of the earlier episodes, Dave Scott. I don't know if you know Dave, but he was basically the godfather of the sport of triathlon. That's what I called him anyway. And he won 6 of the Kona Ironman World Championships in the 80s. And he spent a lot of his career sort of studying performance and nutrition and the effects of performance versus longevity, exactly like you said. And what he was discussing was exactly like you were saying, we all had these refined carbohydrates and everything else. That's what we did in the 80s and 90s. It was preached. We had these carbo loading parties before events, and we would, and anyway, he's since had, excuse me if I get it wrong, but basically some heart conditions. He's 63, 64, and believes a lot of that to do with the combination of the inflammation of having all the refined carbohydrates in combination with the very intense long workouts. So it's one thing to be intense, but like going out for an hour or 2 hours and just doing it as hard as you can, and then adding the inflammation of the refined carbohydrates. And I kind of said to him, do you think you could have been a better athlete had you known, had a more balanced diet back then? And he said yes, he did. And I kind of was looking at his resume going, wow, it was already outstanding. So I was like, it's amazing. But I think it's like you said, when we're consumed and when we're in our 20s and 30s, we're invincible, right? And even our teenage years, we're invincible. And so all we want to do, and I'm definitely one of these people. I've probably turned around to be a little bit more holistic more recently, but I was definitely an all or nothing, run against a brick wall until it breaks type athlete, and definitely overtrained and all sorts of things. And now I'm really worried about going forward. So I'm hoping with this conversation with you now, I can redirect and look at having some form of longevity from the damage that I've probably did in my 20s and 30s. But I'm fascinated about this and what we can do. And I want to talk to you a lot more about that. Before I move on, though, you touched on your work with multiple sclerosis with did you say your brother-in-law?
Yeah, or my stepbrother.
Stepbrother. How did you go with that? Were you able to make what were your findings with that, and were you able to sort of make any differences there?
Yeah. So we create, or sort of, looking at all these different interacting things, like I mentioned, infections, toxins, dietary components, multiple other things. We created an approach that was basically, identifying and eliminating any factors that might be potentially damaging. So that could be heavy metal exposures or something like that, or treating chronic infections, which certainly turns up. And people with multiple sclerosis have some kind of underlying susceptibility to begin with, and then these other factors just sort of add up. And then alongside that, lots on stress reduction, stress mitigation, and then improving the diet with what essentially turns out to be something close to an autoimmune type paleo protocol that people may have heard of. And pretty much at the same time, Dr. Terry Wiles, who again people may have heard of, she's a physician in Iowa who essentially reversed her own multiple sclerosis in terms of symptomatology. She was in a wheelchair, had to quit work, and now cycles to work every day to work as a physician at the VA. She came up with a similar dietary protocol on her own, sort of tinkering it with it sort of on herself. And so I think it's quite nice to think that two sets of people with completely different approaches kind of arrive at similar conclusions and see benefits. So we worked with some sort of informally. I'm not a neurologist, right? So nobody can be my multiple sclerosis patient, but we sort of, put some of the information out there, consulted with a few people through or alongside their doctors. My stepbrother himself has basically been symptom-free, largely without any significant remissions for, it's almost a decade now, particularly when he's, very controlled in terms of his diet, and then also some of the other factors around stress and sleep and other things. And when he's does well from all those standpoints, is essentially you wouldn't know that he had any kind of neurological illness.
That is absolutely fascinating, and congrats to you I love stories like that. So I know this show is predominantly on, I guess, high performance and everything else, but I see that as like just miracle working. So I just love it. And I love that you said you came from it with an engineering kind of mindset. Like it was a really break down the process, systematically. And I think that's just fascinating. And you've been able to take that going forward now into high performance sport, and focusing on the brain in infants and all. I just think this is absolutely outstanding. And just for people that don't know, our background and how we know each other is through, I did some consulting work with Hints of Performance as well with Dr. Luke Bennett as well, and that's how we started working together with a couple of the athletes that we were working with there. And so anyway, I want to move on a little bit, and I want to start with. You just recently put out a paper, Metabolic Health and Lifestyle Medicine should be a cornerstone of future pandemic preparedness. Being that this is what we're all going through right now with COVID-19 is obviously front and center for all of us around the world. And you're sort of talking about how do we do a better job in the future. And I read the paper, and it was fascinating. It spelled out a lot of, for me, kind of obvious things, but I kind of feel like I'm in this medical lifestyle kind of world. But just take me through that a little bit, and what you guys found and what you think we can do in the future. And maybe even just touch on how you think it was handled, your thoughts this time on this pandemic that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, my thoughts on how things are being handled currently is, well, let's say it's very country dependent, and maybe regionally dependent within certain countries. I think it's a difficult question to answer because right at the beginning, nobody really knew what was going on, or what it was going to end up looking like. So a lot of people were quite conservative in terms of trying to make sure lock everything down, really protect people as much as possible, because the possibility that there was going to be very high case fatality rates, there was going to be really serious pandemic in terms of the number of deaths or serious illnesses that it would cause, that then obviously a lot of people were just trying to act in best interest, and I think that was absolutely the right thing to do. There has been some problems with mixed messaging about, say, first people shouldn't wear masks and then they should wear masks, and this is just what was interesting to me. And yes, I think you should wear masks in public for multiple reasons, if not just to make your other human beings feel more comfortable being outside and interacting with you. What was interesting to me was that for maybe the first time, you were seeing science, the public was seeing science happen in real time. And what people maybe don't realize is that the process of scientific inquiry requires you to be wrong multiple times, again and again and again, until you figure out what's actually going on. So arguments such as, well, these guys were wrong before, so how can we trust them now? To me, that doesn't make any sense, because I have seen, most, if not all, well-respected and good scientists be wrong multiple times in their career as we try and triangulate what is closest to the correct or best answer. But you don't normally see that. As somebody who isn't in science, what you see is the media report when the paper is finally published, but you don't see the years or decades of toil and mistakes that get you there. So that was interesting to me, and I think that disconnect is part of why there's still so much disagreement between the different approaches. And I honestly don't know what the right answer is right now in terms of what we should be doing at a population level in terms of exposures and shielding people and social isolation, all that stuff. It's certainly not my area of expertise. However, what we have seen in pretty much every country that's looked at it is that those with chronic health conditions, particularly those associated with metabolic disease, so type 2 diabetes, heart disease, obesity, they are at an increased risk, not necessarily of contracting the virus, but of a severe course of illness and risk of death. And there's so many things that play into this. It's also more prevalent in less privileged populations, which is usually of non-white people in the US and UK, for various reasons that go back decades. And so it's not just a biological thing. It's not that people of different ethnic backgrounds are more susceptible just at baseline. There's all these other things baked in terms of the environments that people live in and the stresses they're exposed to and the quality of the food they have access to or can afford. But all of this creates an increased risk. And so people who have obesity, type 2 diabetes, what you see is a change in the way that the immune system works. And it's the same when you're responding to a flu virus. It was the same with SARS and MERS, the previous coronaviruses before SARS-CoV-2. So it's not just it's not just specific to COVID-19. It's very much a change in terms of how the body responds to these viral infections. And so if we're thinking about the future, and I am certain that in my lifetime, there will be another pandemic of a similar proportion. How we respond to it may be very different depending on the processes we have in place. If we're much better at picking it up early and, developing testing and or vaccines earlier, maybe we don't have to go into lockdowns like we have done now, but I'm sure that this will happen again in the future. And it's more likely to be a strain of flu than it is a coronavirus. That's sort of, people have spent a long time looking at this. And so if you want to look after your population, or if you want to look after yourself, then making sure that you're in good metabolic health is one of the best possible things that you can do. And so that requires everything from improving the quality of the diet, maintaining a good body composition, frequent movement, sleep, stress management, proper social engagement, and having people not be socially isolated. That has a big effect on immune function as well. So all of those things come under the umbrella of lifestyle medicine. And I think that that's something that we can and should be implementing on a whole population level. And it doesn't need to be hard, and it doesn't need to be expensive, and it is very much accessible and open to everybody. It's just hard in the current modern environment in terms of the food you have access to and whether you have the time and ability to implement some of these things. So I think that's why it requires both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. For listeners of this podcast, they may think, well, I don't have obesity, I don't have type 2 diabetes, why on earth is this important to me? And I'd say that's potentially a valid thing to think about. However, it's very interesting to note that some of the people who I know personally who have had COVID-19 and have had very protracted disease courses, not that they got very severe disease and had to be hospitalized, but have had ongoing symptoms for long periods afterwards. They have been very fit, active, healthy people, sort of Ironman champion type people. And when you look at the literature, what you see is that in people who are perhaps overtrained, undereating, you see these same increases in, it's basically cellular oxidative stress that's driving changes in the immune system. And you see very similar changes in the immune system in people who are overtrained, or who have, particularly a very high, do a very high volume of endurance exercise. So these same risks potentially apply to those who are very fit at the other end of the spectrum. So you basically have a U-shaped curve of risk, and those who are doing a large amount of volume, particularly at high intensity, that is also a significant oxidative stressor. And you may get some of these similar changes in the immune system if you're not then sort of adequately either fueling or recovering. So that's why I think it's particularly pertinent to the kind of people who might listen to your podcast, because they may also be at increased risk because of the way that they, because of the way they train, and the other aspects around recovery.
And so what would you recommend? I mean, I've heard this, a number of times, that, athletes have to be careful to not be overdoing anything. But, I've watched, several guests do incredible things, from Ironmans indoors to I've, seen people trying to break their 5K run times and the athletes are trying to find something to do to keep themselves inspired while there's no events. I mean, it's obviously got to be a patience game, but in terms of the kind of volume or the kind of work we're doing, what would you be sort of recommending? Yeah,
I mean, obviously tolerance is very different from person to person. But what, whenever I've been speaking to an athlete or their coach about volume and its benefits, I know there's multiple schools of thought about where you should be spending most of your time in sort of, are you doing very short, high intensity? Are you doing very long aerobic work? Are you working in that sort of in the middle zone around lactate threshold? And I think that last one, spending lots of time there, I think is maximally stressful on the body, with potentially in some people less return on investment in terms of performance that comes afterwards. So if you're trying to moderate volume, then that's one area that I'd look. However, equally, there's benefit from the lockdown in that you should also have a lot more time to focus on other aspects of recovery, like sleep and nutrition. Maybe making sure you're spending time either with loved ones that you live with or around the world. And you're spending time to talk to them because you're not traveling, you're not commuting to work every day. So you potentially have a lot more time to focus on those other aspects of recovery. And it's not that training hard or doing large amounts of volume is necessarily bad. It's just making sure you have the time to recover on the other side. And if people are really digging into it, you can potentially do tests for levels of oxidative stress in the body. You can take supplements such as N-acetylcysteine or cysteine, a little bit of vitamin C. Some of those things may help counteract the negative sort of large volumes of oxidative stress you're producing. But if you can really focus on the other aspects of recovery, then it may well be that the volume itself isn't going to be detrimental.
Yeah, so basically, we're looking at don't run yourself down while this thing is going on.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
one thing.
yeah, it's like I mean, like you said, if you can focus on the sleep and the nutrition, and then obviously, I like what you said in looking after your loved ones and making sure people aren't alone, and the effects of that are physically just as important. And I think I had a guest on recently, Rich Roll, and we were discussing how we're spending a lot more time, FaceTiming and connecting with, our parents and brothers and sisters and I think checking in on each other a lot more than we ever did before. So there have been some kind of positives to all of this,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I read in the article, and I could be wrong, but did you say that less than 20% of Americans are metabolically healthy?
Yes, and it's probably even less than 10%. This is it's a recent paper that came out looking at data from NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is a big study they do pretty much yearly in the US, where they take several thousand people who are supposed to represent the average American, and then they do lots of different things depending on the year, but they usually do some basic blood tests. And in the more recent NHANES groups, they applied the criteria for metabolic syndrome, and slightly better versions of those to look for optimal metabolic health. So it's things like having good levels of HDL cholesterol, its waist circumference, blood pressure, having triglyceride levels below 150, blood glucose levels below 100. This is milligrams per deciliter. Mm-hmm. And they found that less than 20% were ticked all the boxes for optimal in their eyes. What's optimal in their eyes and what's optimal in my eyes is slightly different. So if I applied slightly stricter criteria, so say you might want your triglycerides to be below 100 or your fasting blood sugar to be below 90, then you're basically looking at more than 90% of adults in the US on average having poor metabolic health.
That's incredible. It's probably much the same with Australia and the UK. Yeah. I mean, I feel like most of these countries were all westernized countries and not healthy. I think, like you said, I think most of people listening to this are generally, more than most, probably in that 10%. But it is fascinating to me just to hear how unhealthy metabolically we've become, because I don't think it's always been that way. And I want to discuss with you nutrition and things in a lot more detail a bit further in the show. But it's just fascinating to me. I also read where there's been a lot said about the older generation of being the ones that have been more likely to die from this COVID-19, but you talk about chronological age versus biological and immune age. Can you go into a bit about what you mean by that?
Absolutely. This is one of the, I think, fastest developing areas in the aging field, is to try and find a better way to quantify age beyond how many years you've been on this planet. And there are multiple ways to do it. Like, nobody's really decided which is the best way. You can measure things epigenetically. So you look at methylation on DNA, and these things shift over time. That's probably like the current gold standard. But you can also look at more simple blood tests. You can look at people doing it with like photos of your face and all these other things. And the idea is basically to see how fast is your body aging relative to your chronological age. How many years you've been alive, and discrepancies in that are much more predictive of your risk of death and potentially your risk of changes in the immune system and susceptibility to things like COVID-19. That the difference in your biological age, you call it, compared to your chronological age is probably where most of your risk lies. So obviously, as you get older, you will age, but the rate of that aging is very different from person to person, and is dramatically affected by things like the quality of your diet and how much exercise you do. So there are some very simple things that you can put into place that are going to, basically keep you much more resilient and slow the aging process, which is then is going to, decrease your susceptibility to various diseases. And this is something that still requires a bit of work, I'll admit, because what they've done when they've built these models is that they've used big population data sets, again, similar like NHANES that we mentioned earlier. There are other ones in other countries, but they just use that. They take them in one snapshot of time, and then they sort of create this biological age for a given person, and then look at how that compares to their chronological age, and then how that increases or decreases their risk of, say, all-cause mortality, their likelihood to die. What we don't really know that well yet, because we've only been doing this for a short period, or scientists have only been doing this for a short period of time, is, are these metrics useful in an individual over time? So if I measure my biological age once, when do I need to measure it again? How accurate is it to measure it again? Does that really tell me something about sort of my long-term health? So at the moment, it sort of works on a population level, but there's still some work to do to measure these things in an individual, to have a test that you can track over time and see whether that's going to result in improved long-term health. So it's really promising. It's really interesting, but everybody has a slightly different approach, and we're still sort of figuring that stuff out, which I think is very cool, but it's not quite ready for, like full public consumption yet.
There's a lot that you'd want to sort of be looking at, from DNA to your snapshot of blood work at any given time to all the other things. Like, there's so many variables that you're trying to look at, right? I mean, I think that'd be the hard thing to try and stay on top of. And I've always looked at a lot of the blood work that I've had, and you've even looked at my blood in the last couple of years, and I kind of feel like, well, hang on, I was really dehydrated and overtrained or whatever at that point of time. So does that map out for my next 10 to 15 years? Well,
Probably
I don't know.
Not. But it would affect your results on that day. And, the machine learning algorithm will assume that that's going to be important for 10, 20 years to come. But just because of what was happening on that day, that might not be a picture of your physiology as a whole most of the time. So you're right, that is an issue. It's just like when anybody does any study where they ask people how they eat and then they look at their disease risk 20 years later. It's basically impossible to infer anything from that, because what you think you remember from how you ate for the previous year, that's what they might ask you. How that then reflects how you ate and everything else in your life for the next 20 years. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, but people try and do it, but you realize that in reality there's so much error there that it's probably not worth doing.
I know, these little snapshots that make us feel good or bad about ourselves for a given moment, and then it's like we're a different person a week later, a month later, or whatever. I know. You also touched on in your paper vitamin D. Now, a lot has been said. I think I don't know. Are you friends with Rhonda Patrick?
Not personally, but I know of her work. Very.
Yeah, well, I put you and Rhonda in the same kind of category. You both are doing incredible work, and but I know she was on the Joe Rogan podcast and advocating vitamin D, and she'd done a lot of homework on vitamin D when all this COVID-19 came out. And from what I understand, vitamin D was off the shelves and out of stock within 24 hours of her being on the Joe Rogan podcast. Hence the influence. You mentioned it. You touch on it in your paper. You didn't go into too much detail, but the effects of vitamin D in helping us prepare for the next pandemic. Can you just tell me a bit about that?
Yeah. So there were an increasing number of studies, and actually, when I first started writing the paper, this was now months ago, essentially. And it takes a long time for things to be published in the academic world. So more evidence had accumulated by the time it came out, but don't really worry about that. These things, we always know these things are fast moving, and I tried to preempt that in the paper as well. We certainly weren't going to have all the answers when we wrote it, and may not have all the answers for several years as a community. But there were, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that you are at increased risk of poor outcomes if you have COVID-19, if you are vitamin D deficient, and maybe insufficient as well. And so I don't know if so you mentioned Rhonda Patrick. There was this sort of pseudo spat between Rhonda Patrick and Chris Masterjohn, who's another. He's a nutritional navel gazer with good intentions. But there sort of this back and forth about what level of vitamin D should be the target. And I think we often overcomplicate these things. But having enough vitamin D is certainly important. So what does that mean? If you measure your vitamin D level in the US, have it somewhere between 30 and 40. That's going to be good enough. And ideally, you'd get it from going out in the sunlight if you can. That's always best. That gives a number of benefits beyond just vitamin D. But you could potentially get it from a supplement as well. The problem with if you supplement with vitamin D is the amount that you need to get to a certain level in your blood is very variable from person to person. So you just need to check it again and make sure you don't have too much. As an athlete trying to perform physically, there is some evidence that maybe being just above 40 is slightly better. That's one of the arenas where a certain level of vitamin D is associated with an improvement in health or performances in certain athletic groups. So, if you're somewhere around 40, you're probably in good shape.
I read somewhere, like you said, it's best to get it outside and being in the sun. And from what Laura understands and some of the feedback she's had on some of the work she's done is that, she's better off sort of getting 20-minute doses, throughout the day. And rather than sort of taking a supplement of 5,000 IU in the morning or whatever, she's better off doing little doses throughout the day. I also read or heard somewhere that, you're better off not having sunglasses on. Is that something, do you know anything about that you?
Yeah, so possibly. And I no longer wear sunglasses because of this. And I don't know the true strength of the evidence, but there is some data to suggest that the production of melanin precursors and the signaling from the hypothalamus and other structures within the brain to make melanin to tan in response to sunlight requires the sunlight to also hit the eye. So if you're wearing sunglasses, there's a disconnect between how your body responds to the sunlight, because it's not detecting the sunlight in the way that normally would, which is not just through the skin, it's also through the eye. So if you're wearing sunglasses, then you interrupt some of those signaling pathways, and as a result, you may end up burning more because you're not producing as much melanin as you otherwise would.
Wow.
What's the magnitude of the effect? I don't know. But it's interesting enough for me to think, well, hang on a second. I know there's multiple good things about the sunlight hitting my body. If that also means that some sunlight should go through my eyes, I'm willing to believe that's a thing, because I come from if ever I can't answer a question or I don't understand a question in biology, I try and come from an ancestral type of viewpoint, right? Like, what environment did we evolve in over millions of years? And that one would be this: when the sun is up, it's going into your eyes. So maybe there's some benefit from that. So it's some people might say it's a little woo-woo or wishy-washy, but I most of the time try and avoid wearing sunglasses, because then I have that a true connection between the amount of light that my brain is seeing and my skin is seeing.
So you're telling me they didn't have Oakleys 2,000 years ago?
No, unfortunately not.
No, I'm a bit like you. I've always loved looking back at the ancestors and figuring out, how we've evolved, and not to say modern medicine and everything doesn't have its place and what we've learned, but I certainly enjoy that kind of looking back. And, I often say to Laura when we're talking about nutrition, let's eat, you've probably heard it as well. Let's eat like our grandparents did, that kind of thing. But then I'm like, but it's really hard to eat like our grandparents did these days, because to find grass-fed and finished meats, to find wild fish, to find organic fruit and vegetables, non-GMO, it's actually become hard work to eat like our grandparents did, and far more expensive. So you're kind of like, we can touch on nutrition in a little bit. I just want to finish one more thing with your paper, because it is fascinating, and I hope it gets to the right people, the politicians and things, the people that can actually make some of these, implement them into society, because I don't think we're focusing enough on this. I think we're reactive. We're far too reactive, and we're not focusing on prevention enough. And I think your paper and that kind of thing is what is needed to be heard. And the final bit was, you discussed movement and the importance of movement. And even, 6 minutes before you eat a meal or whatever, just small bits of movement is critical for for the body, for that metabolic health. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, this is particularly pertinent for blood sugar control. And again, some of the data from COVID-19 patients suggests that if you have worse blood sugar control, which is very common in diabetics, but it can also be, large swings in blood pressure are also very common in athletes, again, particularly those consuming a lot of refined carbohydrates. And there is some nice data looking at continuous blood glucose monitoring in fairly high-level athletes. And their blood sugar is all over the place, and it's high a lot of the time because of what they're eating. And so one of the best ways to improve blood sugar control is very frequent and, for listeners of this podcast, quite gentle exercise, like a brisk walk. And if you take people with type 2 diabetes, for instance, and you have them do 5 minutes of brisk walking, or maybe climb up and down a flight or two of stairs every hour, they have better blood sugar control than if you once a day put them in the gym for all that time shoved together. So instead of doing 12 little bursts of 5 minutes, you do an hour on the treadmill. They'll have much better blood sugar control from the frequent small doses of movement. So this is something to do with how, I think we're basically wired to be frequently moving, and that's not something that we're getting a lot of. So of particular importance in lockdown or social isolation, if you're working from home, you may think that you're getting all the benefits from exercise, by getting on your turbo for 2 hours or something, but actually you may get some additional benefit just by making sure you get up and move around, be it the apartment, or swing a kettlebell, or go outside for a brisk walk a few times during the day. That's going to give you much more stable blood sugar throughout the day, which has a whole load of knock-on benefits.
Brilliant. I love that. Because you can get your head around that too, can't you? It's like, I think as endurance athletes, we've always like, more is better, and we got to do these huge workouts. Just a quick mini break before we get back to the show. I just want to remind you guys to go check out athleticgreens.com/Greg. Sign up and get your free 20 daily travel packets with your first order of $79 added value. That's athleticgreens.com/Greg. I know since retiring from sport myself, and Laura and I, it has become a little bit more of that. And now with kids, it's kind of, if we can get a 15-minute workout in and then come back and then another one at lunch and another one, that's kind of what we're trying to do. But I want to move on now and really talk about optimizing our performance today and how that can combine with longevity. And one area that I've been really experimenting with this last sort of 6 months is kind of hot-cold therapy. More so the cold, I've felt that it has really, not only physically, that's kind of one aspect, but I felt like it affected me mentally almost more than anything else has. And I was just doing 15-minute ice bath at around sort of 50 degrees or 12 degrees centigrade. I think that's about right. And doing that to bring my core body temperature down a little bit. And then I just found that it affected my mood more than anything that I've ever experienced. And better than any kind of taking caffeines or any nutritional kind of thing. Can you tell me a bit about why that works and maybe why we should be bringing it in into our lives?
Sure. So certainly a number of potential benefits to both hot and cold exposure. And although their timing around exercise is going to be potentially important. So say you're talking mainly about cold, but just sort of briefly touch on hot, say like dry saunas in particular. They activate a number of similar pathways to exercise. And there have been some studies which suggest that if you sauna after you do a certain workout, you can amplify some of the effects. So you get slightly better improvements in cardiovascular performance or cardiovascular health, or you might potentially improve the muscle protein synthesis response. So like you can potentially stimulate a bit more muscle growth after, say, resistance training if you sauna afterwards. So you're kind of augmenting the exercise that you did. Conversely, if you do cold straight after certain types of exercise, you may blunt the responses to exercise. So it's very good acutely if you're trying to recover quickly so that you can perform again. right? So you might see this in tennis players who are going to play another match the next day, or in CrossFit athletes who are going to compete again in a couple of hours. Then an ice bath could be good, but it might be blunting some of your long-term response to a training session. But if you're trying to get that, decrease inflammation, decrease soreness, so that you can recover and perform again very quickly, then ice baths can certainly help. So the timing around exercise and what you're trying to achieve at the time is certainly important. In terms of exposure and say cognitive performance and health, cold baths are a really great hormetic stressor, being, hormesis being the idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Exercise is another hormetic stressor, and it upregulates a number of things also associated with exercise. So it may be that you're getting, you're altering the autonomic nervous system, right? So vagal tone, the vagus nerve, being the parasympathetic nervous system, sort of like the rest and digest side of your nervous system, that can be upregulated, or its function improved with cold exposure. You might also be getting release of certain hormones that are sort of make you feel good. Endorphins can certainly be released. BDNF, blood-derived neurotrophic factor, which is also increased after exercise, that can be increased as well. Long term, it may improve sort of like your metabolic function. It may increase brown fat production, which can actually sort of increase the amount of energy you can essentially waste and burn off. That's a little bit controversial, but it's possible. So many of the things that you might see in terms of benefits from endurance exercise, you can upregulate some of those pathways as well with cold exposure, and then also effects of the nerve, sort of like the nervous system side of things. It's interesting to note because you're in Florida, right? So it's hot. So one of the we know that both cognitive and physical performance decrease, or can decrease, as core temperature decreases. So one of the benefits may simply be that you're decreasing your core temperature, which just brings you back to a physiological temperature that is more conducive to whatever it is you're trying to perform at in the next hour or two after that. Because you do that with athletes potentially performing in hot environments. You'd stick them in a cool bath for a period of time beforehand, and then they'll perform better in the hour or two afterwards.
It's fascinating, all these stresses. I look back when we were competing full time, and we'd have our ice baths, and we'd do them quite often. But we had different protocols, which, like you said, it was almost like the inflammatory response, after big runs or whatever, so we could back up and train again the next day, kind of thing. And then as I went from sort of the short course racing to the longer, I started going, well, hang on, I want to keep some of that fatigue and stress and make the body have to rebuild itself. And kind of like what you're saying to some degree, the timing of the ice bath, and getting the benefits from it. And now I'm more of I work out half an hour to an hour a day max. Like you said, maybe a couple of walks with the kids and Laura on the beach and that kind of thing. But I'm really not an athlete anymore. I'm just this is about, health and longevity. And so doing these kind of 15-minute ice baths to bring my body temperature down a couple of degrees. And then I'm curious as to your thought of, I try not to warm up too quickly. So, I try and hold the cold for hours if I can. Yeah. I don't have a hot shower. I don't, I might dry myself quickly, but what am I doing to myself there by sort of trying to keep that body temperature down that couple of degrees for, several hours? In fact, even half an hour to an hour later, my body temperature is still going down when I've taken my temperature. Is that a good way to be doing things? A lot of this I kind of read on I think it might have been Rhonda Patrick or somebody. I was reading a document they put out, and I was like, so I've been sort of following that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. There are a number of different things that you're potentially doing. You've now added this as an additional beneficial stressor because you're not doing as much exercise as you were previously doing. So this now comes as something else that's sort of helping your body become resilient and adapt. Because exercise isn't as big a part of your lifestyle as it used to be, which is so then this is another nice thing to add in with the way you've done it, I think it might simply be a case of the total metabolic demands that you're creating, and we know that when you have increased, so say if your body temperature increases, then you'll eventually have a much greater drive to sleep. For instance, you'll produce a lot more adenosine in the brain. That's going to increase sleep pressure. So by decreasing your core temperature, you're decreasing your overall metabolic rate. You're going to decrease the accumulation of some things that may eventually affect cognitive function as they build up over the day. So you're potentially giving yourself this longer period of time where you've got a little bit more, just a bit more capacity, because you're not running your temperature as high. You're keeping your core temperature down by a degree or two. There's that could have those sort of like acute performance benefits, I'm sure.
It's all fascinating to me, and I've been loving doing it. And I had a couple of weeks off doing it, but I'm kind of keen to get back into it because I really do. And like you said, I think being in southern Florida, it's incredibly hot anyway, so it's kind of a nice way to just bring the body temperature down. Yeah. I want to move on and just talk about nutrition for performance. What kind of advice can you give, being that most of my listeners are, probably endurance athletes? Is there any kind of simple tips that you can give them? I know that we're all individuals, but what they should avoid. We've talked about refined carbohydrates, but what other advice can we kind of give going forward?
Yeah. So I think refined carbohydrates, they are an important place to start, just because they've made, they've sort of been the cornerstone of fueling for endurance sports for decades now. And there is some shift there. But still, there's often a, Gatorade, Powerade, carbo loading. There's still an element of that's around and people focus on. And if somebody's trying to think about how this applies to them as an individual, the simplest thing to do is to just test your blood sugar occasionally. You can get a $20 blood sugar meter from the pharmacy. Test it, an hour after meals. Test it in the morning. See how big these swings are. And the big spikes after meals, those are kind of things you want to minimize. And those spikes will happen when you have a large amount of refined carbohydrate, but the size and the type of spike is very different from person to person. What we've learned, particularly in the last 5 years or so of nutrition research, is that you can give two people exactly the same meal and their blood sugar response will be completely different. Like you give two people a cookie and one will have this big spike in blood sugar and the other one, like nothing happens to their blood sugar, like completely unexpected. So just a little bit of looking at what causes large blood sugar spikes. I don't think it's necessarily going to, is it going to like change your performance in the next week or month? Probably not. As much more important will be your total caloric load. Are you fueling enough, essentially? And a lot of the athletes that I ended up working with over the years just weren't eating enough food, particularly because of all the different things that you see in the popular press. So carbohydrates became quote unquote bad for you, and then there was still this hangover of fat being bad for you, and then at one point, and still, like, protein apparently causes cancer, so you can't eat protein, you can't eat carbs, you can't eat fat, and you should and you should intermittent fast because that's good for you. And then and then by the way, please train for 20 hours a week. And that's just like the perfect storm of like just everything starts to fall apart from a physiological perspective, to put it simply. So in the short term, simply eating enough is by far the most important thing. But long term, if you're thinking about the long term health of your heart and your arteries and your muscles and your joints, then blood sugar is it plays a huge role there. So that's where just seeing how you respond to different carbohydrate sources can be really important. Then I think there used to be this everybody has talked about protein in terms of building muscle after particularly in guys doing resistance training, strength training in the gym. But there is an increasing amount of evidence, again, just in the last year or two, that it also improves recovery in endurance athletes. So making sure you're eating enough protein is probably more important for endurance athletes than maybe we appreciated before. And that's something that I'd always encourage as well. And then another thing that I think personally is really important, particularly for long-term health, is the quality of the fats that you eat. So, really reducing your intake of refined vegetable oils, soybean, canola, fried things. These oils tend to crop up in most processed foods, and it's really easy for them to be damaged within the body, cause extra oxidative stress. They interfere with the way that our body handles inflammation. So just reducing the intake of those, I think that has a lot of really long-term benefits as well.
There's so much good advice there. And I guess my next kind of lead-on question to that is, there's so many diets out there, whether we're talking gluten-free, dairy-free, paleo, keto, low carb, whole food, plant-based vegan, or whatever it is. There's everybody seems to go on a tangent. Your thoughts on some of those? I mean, you mentioned intermittent fasting, and I think I've talked about it on this show. I've experimented with that, and actually I've found I don't sustain any of these things. I like to try them for a while. Yeah. And while I was doing that, I actually did find that I felt cognitively really clear without consuming any food in the morning. I'd finish eating at 6 p.m. at night, and then I wouldn't start eating I'd try and do that. Well, it'd be over 12 hours, but basically I get to about 10 a.m., about 16 hours. But in the morning there, while I wasn't eating, I just felt really fantastic. And I got to the point that I wasn't hungry. So I wasn't forcing it. You know what I mean? I wasn't. What are your thoughts? I mean, you mentioned that. Is it something worth trying, or do you think some of these diets and things are just eat like what you just told us, focus on your blood sugar and forget all of these things?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, things are overcomplicated and or bolted on to some kind of ideology that's then somehow just back justified. And as humans, we make decisions based on emotion, and then we rationalize them afterwards. Everybody does it. I do it too. I'm not pretending that I'm some perfect scientific. I can just give you the evidence. Everybody does it. But this is what happens: is people make a decision based on emotion, and then they try and find evidence to rationalize it afterwards. And so, I think all of the diets that you mentioned are great. If you want to eat that way and you feel good, and maybe you do some tests and those look good, why would I have any argument with that? I've literally none. I have a huge amount of respect for Rich Roll. We met actually about a year ago. We did a podcast together. We were sort of on being interviewed on the same podcast, which is great. And I have a huge amount of respect for him, even though a plant-based diet is not my personal preference, nor is it what I would normally recommend to people. But why would you argue with what's working for him? You can't do that. But I think that the most important underlying tenet is eating real food and eliminating highly processed stuff, which messes with appetite regulation. It messes with the hormonal physiology responses to food. It results in all these problems with blood sugar control and other, inflammation downstream. And so whether most of your energy comes from animal foods or plants, I have no real preference. But if it looks like real food, like you bought it from the meat counter or the fish counter, or you got it from the produce aisle in the grocery store, great, perfect. That's my main personal overarching suggestion. When it comes to intermittent fasting, or what you were talking about was what we might call time restricted eating. So you're eating in a narrower window of about 8 hours during the day, and that's similar to what I do. I probably eat between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. And I think there are multiple reasons why you felt cognitively clear in the mornings. You may have an increase in ketone production. which may have some cognitive benefits. It could be that when you eat whatever it is you do eat, you see these large swings in blood sugar, which could negatively affect your cognition. Or you sort of maybe eat a large meal, and that can sort of like mess with your cognition a little bit as well. I'm not sure exactly how you're breaking your fast, but equally, if you're finishing your meal 3 hours before bed, you're going to sleep better, and there's a good amount of data to support that. So by having your last meal at 6 p.m., you'll sleep better, therefore you'll be cognitively more clear in the morning. So there's multiple reasons why that could be the case. And there's some data to suggest that if you narrow your eating window slightly, say to 10, less than 12 hours, 11 or 10 hours, then you might have some improvements in terms of metabolic health as well, in terms of blood sugar control. So all of that can potentially be beneficial. What I will say is that the only time, and I would, if it fits into your lifestyle, then I would recommend it pretty much to everybody. Try and eat within a 10-hour window during the day. But some people it's difficult because they're working. They want to, their family eats dinner late, but then they get a chance to sit down and eat dinner with their whole family. They don't want to sacrifice that, and I completely understand that. I'm not saying that you should sacrifice family time just because of some rigid way of eating. I would definitely prefer that you spend time with your family. But now I've lost my train of thought. The one potential downside is that if you are an athlete doing a large volume of training, you require a large number of calories, and you're trying to eat whole foods, and you're trying to time restricted eat, it'll be very hard for you to get enough calories on board. So at some point, all these things that we talk about in terms of manipulating diet, like macronutrient composition, diet quality, diet timing, they can backfire if you're somebody who is putting in 3 hours a day of training and you just need to eat 5,000 calories. And if you're eating that 5,000 calories from sweet potatoes and chicken, that's going to take a long time and a lot of food and a lot of meals to get it done. So you just need to be wary of what might backfire in terms of just not getting enough calories on board. If you're somebody who's still in the midst of a very large and intensive training program.
That was all brilliant, Tommy. Even though you lost your train of thought, I didn't think you did. I thought that was all fascinating, mate. And I jotting down notes and going, wow, I'm going to re-listen to this and go through it all because it's absolutely fantastic. And I guess on top of that, then, supplementation. Are there any areas that you specifically think people should be definitely supplementing, even if they've got the kind of food the real food kind of diet that you're talking about? That is there still areas that you would suggest for most people to still, like, would you suggest a multivitamin for most people, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, often with the athletes we worked with, I would suggest a good multivitamin. I don't really have any particular brand loyalty, but I like the ones by Thorne, and there are some that are NSF for Sport certified. So if you're a tested athlete, it's nice to know that there's no nasties in there. It's been third party tested. So I do often recommend something like that. I think if you get a good amount of your calories from animal foods, meat, organ meat, particularly eggs, and then you also have, a wide variety of plants in your diet, I think it's unlikely that you're going to be really deficient or insufficient in anything. I think athletes can often do with a little bit more zinc. If they're going to take more zinc, then maybe a little bit of extra copper. Vitamin D is something worth checking. Then the only thing that I would really recommend is creatine. I think everybody should take creatine. It's super cheap, super well researched, really safe. It has multiple benefits in terms of the brain. And then also it's going to have some benefits in terms of particularly response to resistance training and strength, maybe less so on endurance. But yeah, if there's, vitamin D, if you're insufficient, and creatine, those are probably the two that there's very few people that I would recommend not take those.
That's fascinating. I always thought creatine was for that really explosive, all out effort of under 8 seconds or whatever it is. It's like that kind of a thing. But you're suggesting even the layman and endurance athletes?
Yeah. So for a couple of reasons. One being that it is incredibly neuroprotective. In pretty much every animal model it's been studied, in every type of disease it's been studied, if you have creatine on board, it's probably going to protect you if you get an injury. And so that is if you're on your bike and you get hit by a car, or if you're 70 and you have a stroke, I think creatine is going to be beneficial to you. So pretty much anywhere across the lifespan, having some extra creatine in your brain is probably going to be protective. And then it also, making creatine is one of the most methylation intensive processes in the body. So people who are interested in methylation, a lot of your methyl groups go into making creatine. So if some people, for whatever reason, have some problems methylating, they may offload some of that sort of metabolic stress or metabolic requirement by taking some creatine. And there's really no downsides other than so you don't need to load it. You just take like half or like 0.05 grams per kilo. So I weigh 100 kilos. I take 5 grams a day, something like that. And other than when you first taking it, you might have a bit of a few fluid shifts. It might sort of increase, particularly a bit of water retention in your muscles. So you just need to make sure you drink a little bit more after you start taking it. But it's been tested in multiple populations. It's super safe, particularly because most athletes are at risk of some kind of concussion at some point, and everybody's at risk of some kind of brain injury long term. It also, in randomized controlled trials, improves symptoms of depression. And people who eat more foods that create creatine have a lower risk of depression, supposedly. So, yeah, multiple reasons to take it and not many reasons not to take it.
I'm sold. I'm sold, buddy. I'm hitting the pharmacy on the way home from the studio here.
One thing I will say is that make sure that you get Crea Pure, which is made in Germany, and everybody white labels it and sells it. It's super cheap. If it's not Crea Pure, it's probably made in China and it's probably full of a load of stuff that you don't want to put in your body. So make sure that you get creatine monohydrate that's branded as Crea Pure. But pretty much every sports supplement company will have Crea Pure that they white label. But that's just the one caveat.
Brilliant. Thanks, buddy. That is absolutely really helpful. I just want to move on a little bit here. Again, one of the big things that we do in endurance sports is, and just lifestyle things, is caffeine. What are your thoughts on the types of caffeine, whether it comes from coffee or no-dose or green tea or whatever it is? What are your thoughts on using it both for physical activity or even just on a daily dose things, and the effects it has physically and obviously on the brain? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so why do you just ask about caffeine? There was a really interesting study in rugby players where they looked at they sleep deprived them, and then they looked at the effect of caffeine or creatine on skills performance in rugby players. And both caffeine and creatine both improve performance after sleep deprivation. So that's another tick for creatine. Just because I forgot to mention it. So caffeine, I'm a big fan of caffeine. But if it kind of depends on why you're taking it and how you're using it. So if you want to use caffeine as an ergogenic, right, to improve performance, you probably need quite a large dose. And by large dose, I mean 6 to 8 milligrams per kilo, which is basically like 6 venti coffees from Starbucks.
Yeah.
So it's a lot.
What is that, like 400? Yeah, it's about 400 milligrams or something. Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, so for me it'd be 600 to 800 milligrams. It's a lot of caffeine. So that's where most of the evidence base for caffeine's ergogenic effects comes from. And also you have a much greater effect if you're caffeine naive. So if you haven't had any caffeine for a long period of time. So if you want to use caffeine to boost performance, A, you need to take quite a bit, and B, you should not use it regularly. It should be what you should be used to it, but it should be what you should use when you're trying to have a given performance, like during a race. The rest of the time, when you take caffeine and you feel better, it's probably getting you back to baseline because you're in some form of caffeine withdrawal, which is basically how I am every morning. And I will say that I've recently, in the last year, probably halved my caffeine intake and also shifted it much earlier in the day, and I sleep much better. The half-life for caffeine is quite long. So on average, if you have any caffeine after midday, at least 25% of that is still going to be circulating in your body by the time you go to sleep.
Wow.
And that's going to have a real effect on your sleep. So that's worth bearing in mind. Another thing with caffeine and some other things that you might take to boost cognitive performance is that depending on the scenario, so particularly if you're sleep deprived and you're trying to do cognitive work, you might feel that caffeine is helping your brain. But if you do objective tests, you're not actually performing any better. And we see this with multiple things, is that like you think that you're performing better, but you're actually not. It's not really making any difference.
Placebo only.
It's like, yeah, exactly. Or, in some scenarios, you might actually be performing worse, even though you think you're performing better. So it really depends on, what it is you're trying to achieve. I drink coffee, like black coffee, because I really like it. I've become a big sort of coffee snob in the last couple of years, and sort of like tried lots of different coffees and brewing methods, all that kind of stuff. I just find it super interesting. But I don't use caffeine. I used to use caffeine for performance, which involved heroic doses and sort of like pre-workout supplements and all that kind of stuff. And then, like, as a result, my sleep was wrecked, and I was overstressed all the time, and the caffeine definitely contributed to that. So it can really be beneficial, but if you're using it for performance, either cognitive or physical, it requires quite sort of concerted usage. The rest of the time, you're just drinking it because you're within withdrawal, and it just takes you back to like your normal baseline rather than actually improving your performance.
It's funny you talk about like going off caffeine. You reduced yours since Laura got pregnant with our first baby, our first child. She went off coffee, sugar, alcohol, everything. So I've lost my partner in crime with all the fun stuff, and so I went off it. I basically I went off it substantially anyway, and it's only been sort of more recently that I've started back. Just with a little bit of. I have an English breakfast black tea, and I'm just sort of enjoying that at the moment with a little bit of Manuka honey or whatever, and that's kind of it. And that's 1 cup a day, and it's hardly anything. Sometimes I'll take a micro dose. I'm working with a company, Four Sigmatic, with the mushroom teas and things like that, and I'm really loving their products. And they have a new thing called the Focus Shot, mushroom focus shot, which is a combination with their lion's mane mushroom, and there's 50 milligrams of caffeine in that. And I do feel like reinvigorated, and I feel pretty good on it, but maybe I'm starting to question it. Do I feel like that, or is it just because I've got a great guest that I'm talking to on the podcast and I'm totally amped? But it is that kind of combination. But I have a funny story when you talk about that kind of macro dosing on and really seeing how you feel. So I did a 70.3 Ironman probably back in. It was right towards the end of my career, so 2015, 2014, and I was like, I got to experiment on this caffeine. And so I went off it for a month or so, and was getting ready for this 70.3, and early season one, just wanted to see how I'd go. And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll take no caffeine for the swim or for the race, but with about 40K to go on the bike, I'm going to take, I think I took 600 milligrams.
Oh, yeah.
Boom. All in no-dose tablets. Bang, bang, bang. Mate, I rode away from the pack. I think I rode that last 40K as quick as I did in any of my Olympic distance races. Got off, ran the first 10K of the half marathon, just unbelievably. And then, boom, the lights went out to the point where I was walking and I got caught literally as you make the final turn with 100 meters to go, and I lost the race and came second.
Oh, no.
So there is that kind of macro dosing does have its effects, but there must be some kind of dramatic side effect that goes with it. That's how I felt, because I never did that again. I was like, I'm not going to go that crazy on it. What happened there? What do you think? Is that a dehydration thing? Tell me what happened. I'm still bummed about not winning that race.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I couldn't tell you exactly what happened, but because it depends on the theory that you prescribe to in terms of the things that govern performance. People may have heard of Tim Noakes's central governor theory, right, where it's basically it's all controlled. There's this sort of like central control of the brain by the brain that's trying to stop you basically doing yourself an injury or some kind of harm by pushing itself too hard, and you have to kind of train that up and show your brain that it's okay. And that's this is certainly the case with tight muscles and other things, that there's some kind of central component that's regulated. I'm not saying that this is definitely the reason that these things happen, but it's interesting because what's essentially happened in one way or another is that because of the huge dose of caffeine, you have felt able to get more out of your body than it was actually really willing to give, and then whatever the rate limiting step was, you ran out of that. And this is what happens with a lot of performance enhancers, is that you can get more out of your body or your brain for a given period of time.
Until exhaustion almost.
Yeah. But I always say there's no biological free lunch. Like at some point, you're going to have to pay that back. In whatever respect it is. And so it's like, if people go and they go to a rave and they take MDMA and they feel amazing, right? Like everything's firing at 300% for that evening. And then for the next 2 weeks, they feel depressed because they've basically just completely emptied neurotransmitter banks and just like everything is done. And so this is what generally happens, when you pharmaceutically enhance performance in the short term, you may well perform better, but is it going to get you all the way to the finish line first? Like that's the important thing. And then is like, how are you going to pay for that later? And so somehow the caffeine tricked you into giving more than you had, and you didn't quite pace it right to the end.
No, I didn't. Is there any kind of, you mentioned you're a coffee snob, and I think I kind of have been over the years. I mean, you're in Seattle with Starbucks and all that around you. I'm sure you're not probably heading down to Starbucks, but is there any kind of specific caffeine? Like I've heard green tea is the caffeine that you should be doing and that kind of thing. Is there specific caffeine that you'd recommend, or is it not matter?
Yes. So the green tea thing, which is also replicated in a number of supplements, is probably because there's L-theanine in there with the caffeine form. It's theophylline is the form of caffeine that you usually get in tea. And there are some studies that suggest that if you take L-theanine with caffeine, you get basically less of the sort of jittery side effects of the caffeine, and maybe some improvement in terms of particularly the cognitive benefits, if you're thinking about cognitive performance. So that's why I think green tea is potentially sort of lauded as a good way to get your caffeine, is because L-theanine is already in there. Some supplements come with caffeine and L-theanine together. I certainly feel fine with my coffee, which doesn't have any L-theanine in it, but some people might recommend that you take some L-theanine with your coffee in the morning. I've tried that a few times. I didn't notice a big difference, but that's probably the reason why they say that. There is some variability in how people respond to different forms. So the xanthine in coffee, which is more like traditional caffeine, theophylline in tea, theobromine in chocolate, they all have very similar structures and interact with the adenosine receptor in the similar way, so they have that kind of that same effect. So dark chocolate late at night, if you're susceptible, is similar to having coffee. There's usually about 1 milligram per gram of dark chocolate, something in that region. But some people, like, they'll eat chocolate and it has no effect, but they'll drink black tea and everything goes crazy. So there is some like personal variation in terms of how people respond to the different types as well.
It's all fascinating. I love all of that. I mean, you mentioned sleep. It's an area that I've been kind of working on. I've found the last few years I've been sleeping very well between about 9 p.m. and then I wake wide awake, really hot at 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning. And I've just gone and purchased myself a chili pad thing. Cost me a fortune, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm testing it out, everybody. This is not a sponsorship pitch. I'm just trying it out. And I have noticed that I still wake at that 1 or 2 a.m., but because I'm cooler, I'm able to get back to sleep a little bit better. So I think it's working. I'm still not sure if it's just in my mind, and I still feel like I can't even get the bed cold enough. I think I'm running at a really high temperature. Have you got I mean, you've got no blood test in front of you or anything about me, but do you kind of have any theories on that?
Yeah. So it certainly sounds body temperature related. I mean, there are some ways that you can hack around that. I mean, having an earlier dinner is certainly beneficial, right? Because if you're still digesting, you may have particularly if you have a large protein, and you should eat protein. But if you have a large load of protein at bedtime, sometimes that could maybe maintain your metabolic rate. It has a higher thermic effect, protein compared to other foods. So particularly if you're eating it close-ish to bedtime, there may be benefit to stretching that out. Having a hot shower before bed can improve heat loss at bedtime. So that speeds, it decreases sleep latency, so people fall asleep sooner, but that can sort of like help you offload some temperature. Wearing
hot
socks,
shower, not a cold shower.
Yeah,
I've been doing cold all this time.
Yeah, so it may be that because you've had a cold shower, yes, you rapidly decrease your core temperature, but then your body fights that to try and bring your core temperature back up, and that eventually wakes you up.
That's awesome.
So the opposite happens if you have a cold shower, a hot shower or hot bath before bed. That improves your heat loss, which is what you want. So it's actually the opposite.
Wow.
And there's one study, apparently. So my friend Dr. Greg Potter, he's an expert in circadian biology, and he told me about this study. And most of the tips, if I talk about tips for sleep, they usually came from him. If you wear socks in bed, apparently that improves your heat loss elsewhere, so that can improve sleep as well, like counterintuitively. So those would be my three things to consider to try and improve temperature regulation and maintain a lower core body temperature when you're sleeping.
I can't get over that. That's gone opposite to everything I've been doing. And I mean, I think I struggle with that. What do they call it? That Raynaud's. I get very hot hands and feet, or they go very, very cold. I don't.
Oh yeah,
in between. Yeah. So the idea of wearing socks to bed freaks me out, to be honest. I think.
So I tried it, and it was just super weird for me because I actually have my feet out because I feel like that keeps me cooler. But the idea is that it shunts sort of the shunts blood elsewhere, and then that you're better at offloading heat from other parts of the body. I think that's it. But anyway, but hot baths and showers. Try a hot shower instead of a cold one.
Yeah,
you'll feel hotter initially, but you'll lose core temperature faster.
That is fascinating to me. I mean, I prefer a hot shower. The cold showers get exhausting after a while. So that sounds fantastic. Now, I know I've kept you a long, long time, but I do want to touch on what you're actually working on right now. And I want to discuss sort of the minimizing the risk and recovery from head injuries like concussion. I've had so many, I retired. I think I had 33 bike crashes and 4 of them with cars. And I played rugby before that. So I've had my brother's been out more than I have. He was a professional rugby player. So it is an area of interest to me. Can we quickly just touch on what we can be doing if we have had hits, perhaps to help our brains?
Yeah, so
in 1 minute or less. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. well, so most of it is basically this is my personal bias, but what I like about all the things that I've talked about is that they're all relevant to everything that we're interested in. And so I guess there's 2 different stages there. So let's talk immediately or in the early period after getting a concussion. Well, first let's start before you get the concussion. Important things, creatine. And then one thing that I'm increasingly interested in and trying to do some active research in is some of the fat stuff that we talked about. So reducing particularly vegetable oils, soybean, canola, fried foods, they're in processed foods because they mess with inflammatory signaling and they're very susceptible to oxidative stress. But at the same time, making sure that you have enough of the long chain omega-3 fatty acids, so DHA and EPA. So just like, a few times a week, have a tin of sardines or some seafood. If you really have to, you can supplement with it. But so reducing those, it's particularly linoleic acid. This is an omega-6 fatty acid found in vegetable oils. Less of that. Making sure that you have adequate long-chain omega-3s, so some seafood. That's going to make sure that you're in the best position to respond to the inflammation that's going to happen once you get your head hit. Plus creatine. So those are like my pre-concussion things. Immediately after the concussion, super important for recovery of the brain after any injury is blood sugar. So if you get a concussion, really that's a time to avoid refined carbohydrates. Yeah, Powerade, Gatorade, anything, breads and cakes and cookies. I'd really keep those out for, at least the weeks after the concussion, because large swings in blood sugar are really bad for the brain, particularly when it's recovering from an injury. Then I think we're going to learn a lot more. And again, something that I'm actively researching about, ketones, either ketogenic diets or exogenous ketones as neuroprotective agents after concussions. There are salts and esters. The ester is probably the best thing that you can get at the moment on the market for exogenous ketones. I don't have the perfect protocol to recommend because it hasn't really been studied, robustly in that arena, but that work is happening right now. So I think that's going to happen. That's going to happen in the next couple of years. That's going to come to the fore. But, if you have experience with, some people may take ketone esters because they have an ergogenic benefit in endurance athletes acutely. So if you have some experience with those, then they may be worth taking regularly.
If you've got a big enough bank account.
If you've got a big enough bank account, because to keep your ketones high with the ketone ester definitely requires deep pockets. So it's not required, but it's a super interesting area that I think is gonna, and I know of other companies that are trying to make these things much more affordable. So that's going to be important too. The other thing again is temperature control. So after any kind of brain injury, it's really important that the brain doesn't get too hot. So when when we look at brain injury responses, if you have some kind of fever afterwards, then that's usually associated with a worse outcome across a range of different types of brain injury and severities of brain injury. So the reason why that's important is because one thing that is important for recovery from concussions is movement and exercise. So as soon as you're able, and if you had a severe concussion, you'll probably have some kind of coach or physio who will help you with this, but some kind of graded return to exercise, light aerobic exercise, walking, is going to be really important, as basically, within a few days or a week or two. But if you do that, you don't want to get too hot. So there have been some so I've worked with some coaches who have athletes who've had concussions. And when we talked about returning to exercise, particularly if they start to, get back on the turbo or something like that, that's usually the kind of exercise they're going to be doing. Making sure they're in a cool environment. And if they can't be in a cool environment, then ice packs or ice vests can be really important. Sort of getting some cooling around the arteries and the veins in the neck can probably keep your brain cooler, stop it overheating. So I think that's potentially important. Then also sleep. Sleep is going to, getting to like a robust circadian rhythm is going to be really important. So that's, and then all of those things I think long term are also potentially important. Blood sugar control, sleep particularly. Maybe even bringing some ketones on board or a ketogenic diet if you start to see some kind of long term cognitive effect of your concussions, then I think that's going to be potentially beneficial as well. So that's kind of that it was more than a minute, but that's my
mate, I was only teasing, and I honestly, if it's not you, I'd have you on for another hour or two. So I don't want to take any more of your time. I have one final question, and it's just an area that I'm really passionate about, and people that listen to this podcast would recognize it is. I've always loved visualizing, and I'm a big dreamer, and I rehearse visualizing a lot for key performances, or even if it's not athletics, it can be other things. Even like this podcast and this show, I visualize where I want it to go, and the hormonal aspect of that is what I'm intrigued by, because I kind of believe that I can visualize while I'm lying on a massage table, create a hormonal kind of effect. That then affects me physically. Would you agree that the brain has that kind of, if you're good enough at visualizing and how that works? Yeah,
absolutely. What you think has a direct effect on your physiology. And I mean, we can come at that from so many different angles. So if we're thinking about it, in terms of like visualization and hormones and performance, I guess I don't have a huge amount of evidence to underlie that. But there is plenty of evidence to suggest that what you're told about, say, your genetics directly affects your physiology. It can change hormone levels. It can change how you perform on a treadmill. even if it's not actually true, even if you're just told that at random and it's completely different from what your genetics actually say. So what you think about what your body can do and how it can perform directly affects hormones. They can see changes in hormone levels just because of what they've been told, right? And nothing else. You see the same thing. So Ellen Langer has done some really cool work looking at how thoughts affect physiology. She did a study where they looked at chambermaids in hotels who are generally overweight and have some metabolic health issues. And they randomized them to either just like continue as they normally would, or by telling them that, the work that you do, moving the Hoover and changing beds and walking up and down stairs, you're doing a load of exercise just at work. And just by telling them that, they saw an improvement in their health and they lost weight, which is insane.
Wow, I love that.
We've also seen if people who have, people undergoing cognitive behavioral therapy as part of some psychological program for something, they see improvements in immune function. They say improvements in hormonal function. So there was one study where women who had lost their normal cycle, like the normal hormone cycle, underwent CBT, nothing else changed, and their cycle returned. So there are so many ways in which what you think can directly affect hormones. So and then the physiology beyond that. So yes, in each exact scenario, the evidence may not exist, but if you triangulate all these different places whereby just changing the way you think could directly affect your hormones, then I absolutely think it's true.
I love that. And you know what? I'm going to have to bring you on again, and we're just going to spend the whole time just talking about the effects of the hormones on the physical body and how we can utilize that, in sporting performances or elsewhere in our life. Because I'm blown away by it, and I still feel like we're very early in the stages of understanding the true power of the brain. And I know you're doing a lot of work on that now. And so I'm going to have to bring you back on, and we're going to have to dissect that even a lot more. Because
there's a great talk by a good friend of mine, Dr. Brian Walsh. He gave it at a conference I ran in Iceland a few years ago. I think there's something about thought-driven physiology. It's on YouTube. I'll send you the video. And actually, a lot of the studies that I just talked about, he mentions in that talk. You'll love it.
Perfect. Well, we'll add that to the show notes. So people listening, I'll upload that. Also on the show notes, I'll have, so people, if they want to reach out to you, Tommy, they can get you either on Instagram at Dr. Tommy Wood. I'll put that in the show notes as well for people that want to do it, and your website, drragnar.com. And I can't help but say your Icelandic name and think of the show Vikings with Ragnar Lothbrok. So that's a really awesome name. I love it.
Thanks.
I didn't realize until doing this homework for this show that you had, I knew there was some kind of a British and American. I didn't realize you had Icelandic as well. And then I saw your website, and everybody wants to check it out. drragnar, so ragnar.com. Go check it out. And you've got a lot of blogs and podcasts that you've done on there. And for people that want to have any consulting from you or any kind of extra work, they can just contact you either on Instagram or through your website, correct?
Yeah, so I don't do much like one-on-one client consulting anymore, but I do quite a bit of working with coaches who have athletes or clients. So one way or another, if I can be of any help, please reach out and we'll figure something out.
Mate, I just absolutely have enjoyed this, 92 minutes of your time we've been chatting, and it's just gone so quick. I've just loved every minute of it, and once again learned so much more, whether it be creatine or, blood sugar, caffeine, and I just really, really appreciate it. Just fantastic. And, so anybody listening, if you want to go check out the show notes, it'll have all the links. It'll have timestamps. If you want to go back and look at, specific things that we've talked about, you can do that there. But Tommy, really appreciate it, mate. Thank you everybody for listening as well. It's been just wonderful to have this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is a huge amount of fun. It was great.
Cheers, buddy. Stay on the line, and we'll chat in a bit. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot for listening to Be With Champions. If you've enjoyed the show, your support would truly be appreciated. You can visit the Be With Champions Patreon page, or you can subscribe with your podcast app of choice. Don't miss the next episode, so subscribe and be notified. For show notes, if you want to know more, please visit BennettEndurance.com. I'm Phil Liggett, and on behalf of Greg Bennett, Here's to the next time, and I hope you will join Greg again very soon.